Hi, hello, and welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. How are you doing? It's good to be back. Today, I wanted to talk to you about the architecture of Georgian England. The Georgian period was a really important period where Industrial Revolution was taking off. London was the world's largest and most prosperous city. However, London's architectural monuments were really lackluster in the time in comparison to other global cities, and that was because there was spending limits placed on the monarchy. But this was all about to change, and the Georgian era gives birth to some of London's best buildings, which are still standing today. Britain is at a crossroads. Industrial Revolution is taking off, filling our cities with smoke and fog. The Anglican spires, which once pierced the skyline, are being replaced with chimneys from factories, and factories are paying homage to their great new frontier, the doctrine of the free market. The classical liberalism that was permeating political and societal circles was met with attention, of the monarchy wanting to make its mark on the City of London and of its residents, but with those residents sick of seeing public money spent on war and any monument to celebrate the war and the monarchy that oversaw it. Despite this tension, London was a big, booming metropolis and the most powerful city in the world, and the Georgians eventually absolutely left their mark. The buildings from this period are perhaps my favourite to be found throughout the city. So today I'm going to take you on a trip down into the most iconic works of King George IV and his favourite architect, John Nash, and into a geography of Georgian architecture in London, which can only be described as gorgeous. What is the Georgian period? The Georgian period spans from 1714 to 1830. It was named after the first four British monarchs of the House of Hanover, from George I to George IV. The Hanovers were a European royal house with lineage relating to parts of Italy, Germany, and Russia. George I spoke little English, and he took over from the Stuarts with the death of Queen Anne in 1714. He was not particularly popular in the British Isles, being considered a foreigner, and he didn't really like England back. He was the great-grandson of James I of England and the first in line up to the throne when the British Parliament ruled in 1701 that only a Protestant could rule England, which brought the end to the Stuart lineage. George I was replaced by George II in 1727 upon his death, who ruled until 1760. George II fared better as the period saw important colonial victories in Canada and India, and was the last monarch to fight alongside his countrymen in battle. In architectural terms, the arrival of the Georgian monarchy in 1714 brought with it a break with the Baroque style of the past, which had given us St Paul's Cathedral, Castle Howard, and Buckingham Palace. Originating in Rome, Baroque was a cultural movement throughout Europe in the 17th century. It was dramatic, vibrant, and appealing to all senses, with contrast and theatricism. It was perhaps a little too ostentatious for British sensibilities. English Baroque was far more understated, with a reserved style, popularised by Sir Christopher Wren, who was responsible for building many of London's iconic buildings after the Great Fire of London. Seen as a representative of Catholicism and foreign reliance, Baroque fell away in favour of a more restrained type of architecture, Palladianism. The Palladian style was based in proportion and symmetry and simplicity, and was popular between 1715 and 1760. It was heavily inspired by Venetian architect Andrea Palladio, and was favoured by political elites. It is characterised by symmetry, proportion and balance, temple fronts and columns, steps leading up to a centrally placed door, a central dome, and a central arched window flanked by two smaller rectangular windows. The Georgian architectural legacy stretches far beyond grand houses and public buildings, however. The Regency era of Georgian architecture made its mark on some of the most impressive and iconic landmarks in London. The Regency style was only a short period between 1811 and 1820, where George Frederick ruled as Prince Regent in place of his father, George III, who was declared mentally ill. He had extravagant, excessive, and expensive taste. And this came through in his urban design, in its classical form of architecture that consists of playful, light looks and flamboyant elements. With access to new building materials, the stucco facade became popular in this period. This is a fine plaster made from lime or chalk, which imitates stone, for a quarter of the cost. Depending on the material, these would take a pastel colour, which contrasts with the terracotta preference of later Victorian periods. In contrast to the pasty exterior, ironwork was incredibly popular both in construction and decoration of Regency-style buildings, used in structural beams, columns, staircases, and balustrades. It was popular because it could easily be cast to form complex-looking decorations and was corrosion and fire-resistant. Until the end of the 17th century, most windows were in a casement design, opening inwards, set horizontally and not always symmetrical. However, with the Victorian period, saw tall and vertical sash windows becoming popular. These are small panes of glass built into wooden bars, which open and shut like a guillotine, with a pulley system, meaning they do not infringe on indoor space. They were also inset 1 inch into the building, which was a practice to help slow the spread of fire after the Great Fire of London in 1666. Sills would be slanted, sliding down towards the outside, helping the runoff of rain and to reduce drafts. Most houses were in terraces, and the crescent shape was very popular, with each door usually being flanked by a column. They used Welsh grey slate for the roofs to contrast the stucco exterior. The Napoleonic War was a critical factor in the expansion of Regency-style architecture. During the war, the government could not afford to build new houses. There was high taxes on building materials. In 1810, there was a serious financial crisis where, due to the demand for housing was the only asset not to lose its value in London. After the victory at Waterloo in 1815, there was a financial boom, and so Regency style, with all its pomp, grandeur, symmetrical fronts, and proportional design, became all the rage. John Nash served as the court architect for the Prince Regent and was one of the most successful and influential architects. He is responsible for the streets, squares, terraces, and crescents that give London so much of its unique character. And he was commissioned to develop swathes of central London, including so many iconic landmarks, including Regent Street, the redevelopment of Regent's Park, Marble Arch, and Buckingham Palace. The redevelopment of Regent's Park and Regent Street is a pretty incredible story. It was the largest single urban construction project undertaken by the British government at its time. Initially, it was going to cost £314,000, but ended up costing northwards of £1.7 million. In 1806, the lay of the land was unrecognisable. Since the time of Henry VIII, the Crown owned the farming and hunting lands in the area of Marylebone. These lands had been leased to the Duke of Portland for agricultural use, but was going to revert back to the Crown in 1811. The Prince Regent was living in Carlton House, which is near Buckingham Palace, and wanted direct access to Regent's Park. The Prince Regent's architectural bestie, John Nash, specialised in residential design, and so took the position of architect to the Office of the Woods and Forests to redevelop the Crown lands and the street connector. As much as this was a project that would connect the monarchy to central London, it's not clear how much the prince actually influenced designs. Having come out of the Napoleonic War, this type of self-indulgent spend during a time of austerity would have been greatly opposed. National monuments celebrating victory would not have been considered appropriate. The project, therefore, was justified financially on the grounds of the long-term economic benefits that would far outweigh the substantial public money required. Regent Street was built in 1819. It was the original purpose-built shopping street for London and is one of London's first town planning developments. It runs from Waterloo Palace in St James's to Regent's Park. The original layout of the street has survived to this day, and Nash's design divides Mayfair and Soho, curving east between Oxford Street and Piccadilly. The development was finished in 1826 and immediately became the centre for London's social scene. It was actually intended to be a Champs-Élysées-style road, a straight, wide road linking the Prince to the park. However, the road couldn't be straight because of existing land ownerships. The residents of the neighbourhoods did not take well to being displaced and dispossessed. The building of Regent Street, according to Charles Pitt, was accompanied by aggressions on individual property, which was seriously oppressive to common freedom. When the land of Marylebone Park was reverted to the Crown, Nash designed Regent's Park to be a summer palace for the Prince Regent. His approach was pioneering in terms of town planning. However, it was typical as an urban royal estate. There was an interior parkland and a residential royal development, which were fundamentally related and interconnected. It was described as an enchantingly rural plan, embracing landscape gardening. There was an outer circle for a carriage, which was a dividing line between the interior parkland and exterior residential terraces, and was designed specifically to take the visitor around a sequence of carefully constructed landscapes. Public access was one of the most contentious issues surrounding the park, and it had always been viewed as a public entity, however, was not always fully accessible. Maria Edgeworth said at the time that she was properly surprised by the new town that had been built in Regent's Park, and indignant at the plaster statues and horrid useless domes and pediments crowded with mock sculpture figures which damp and smoke must destroy in a season or two. We can't talk about the legacy of John Nash without mentioning his transformation of Buckingham Palace. Originally Buckingham House, the site was a mulberry plantation and a silkworm farm owned by John Sheffield, the Duke of Buckingham. Though the building was demolished to make way for a new home for George III and Queen Charlotte, who acquired it in 1762, it went by the name Buckingham House until 1820, when George IV made the house a palace, putting our very favourite John Nash in charge of the work. Nash took the humble house, adding wings to the west and more branches to the north and the south of the building, creating an impressive 53 rooms, 90 offices, and spanning over 77,000 square metres. It was designed in French neoclassical architecture, supported by large columns, was symmetrical, and with a facade made of Portland stone. The interior was inspired by Baroque and Rococo features, with a grand entrance, stairs, balconies, and a colour scheme of cream and gold, blue and pink. Its location is important. This is a densely populated area of London with Roman citadel roots, creating a contrast for local residents to enjoy and appreciate a royal park, connecting people and the state. Marble Arch was supposed to be a grandiose gateway to an expanded Buckingham Palace and an exuberant celebration of British victories in the Napoleonic Wars. And this is a design of what it should have looked like, a dramatic scene of Waterloo and of Lord Nelson's naval victories, including George IV on top of a horse, all fitting together like a dramatic three-dimensional puzzle. The overall design was approved and sculptures commissioned in 1828. However, when the king died in 1830, Nash was sacked for overspending on the project by the Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington. And the architect, Edward Blore, was then commissioned to finish the complex structure in a more economic and sensible fashion. However, the scorned Nash refused to cooperate, meaning that many of the sculptures didn't actually make the final cut and were donated to the National Gallery, with the final design looking rather plain. Nash's redevelopment of Buckingham Palace wasn't exactly considered a success. It has been criticised for being ambitious and hastily executed, meaning some wings needed to be rebuilt at an extortionate cost. By 1830, when the king passed away, Nash's funds had been exhausted and he passed away in 1835, with Buckingham Palace still incomplete. The best example of Nash's work is the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which was inspired by a blend of Indian, Mughal, European and Chinese architecture. These were inspired by design forms and motifs taken from British colonial exploits overseas. But built as a retreat for King George IV, this Indian-style building transformed the fortunes of Brighton, attracting wealthy visits, symbolising fun, innovation and a healthy disregard for convention. It has become a synonym of rebellion and embracing alternative lifestyles, and it is thought that it's contributed to the rich culture of the city. But I think that's a story for another day. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this coverage of the Regency period of architecture in London. I was honestly so surprised to hear about how Regent Street and Regent's Park came to be. I hadn't actually anticipated they would be so young. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Geography Girl, and I'll see you for part 2 next week, where we'll take a look at Greek and Gothic revival architecture.